Hello, everyone. I am Jeannie Buller, Manager of Member Engagement for Conexxus. Conexxus will be your co-host with Visa for this webinar today. Visa will present an overview of current AFD fraud trends, including why fraud is accelerating at the pump, fraud rate changes over time, and how to spot a skimmer and what to do if you find one. Visa will look at what states are seeing the most fraud and the efforts to help to curtail these attacks. The presenters will provide information on Visa Fraud Monitoring Program and what it means for you, and review the basics on liability responsibilities both now and into the future. They'll also walk through how to work with your acquirer if you believe there are criminal activities occurring at your locations, and best practices for managing your fraud at the pump. As a previous technology professional in the fuel and convenience store industry, this topic of fraud and how to prevent it was a big concern for the convenience store organization that I worked for in the past. So I look forward to this webinar and learning more from Visa. Next. A quick overview of the agenda. We have some housekeeping, introduction of the presenters, a few comments about Conexxus, and then the presentation. Q&A will be at the end. Next. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available in approximately 30 days. It will be accessible on the Conexxus website and also on YouTube. The slide deck will be provided to attendees once you complete the survey link provided at the end. Please enter your questions via the webinar interface. And if time doesn't allow us to answer all questions, you will receive an email with your question and answer from the Visa presenters. Next. Today's webinar is hosted by Allie Russell of Conexxus. Again, I am Jeannie Bullard of Conexxus and will be your moderator for today's webinar. The speakers today are Robert Alanda. He's a Senior Director in the Merchant Solutions Organization with Visa. Robert has over 30 years of domestic and international experience in the financial services and electronic payments industry. His diverse experience includes chargeback mitigation, risk management, and card payment acceptance. For the past 6 years, he has been primarily focused on helping fuel merchants optimize their Visa acceptance. Andrew McCoy is the Senior Director of North America Risk for Visa. He is developing partnerships opportunities with acquirers and merchants, exploring better ways to collaborate and share information in order to reduce fraud and increase security in the payments ecosystem. Before his role in risk, Andrew was Director of Global Interchange, responsible for Visa interchange strategy and merchant investment deals in the United States. Next will be Sydney Green. She's a Senior Director in the Risk and Authentication Product Organization at Visa, where she focuses on creating strategic solutions for merchants and acquirers to help manage fraud and associated costs. She has more than 15 years experience within the payment space, across from the terminal hardware product strategy to services solutions to payment processing. While at Visa, Sydney has worked specifically to create risk services for the U.S. fuel merchants, which has been shown to help manage fraud at the pump and inside C-stores. Next. Conexxus is an independent, nonprofit-driven technology organization. Our members volunteer their time to set standards and provide education in areas of data exchange, security, and mobile commerce. We are a separate organization from NACS, the National Association of Convenience Stores, but we work closely with NACS to provide its members with a vision as to emerging technology. Technology is our policy, and our goal is to advocate that to the industry, to the convenience and fuel industry. Next. This is the contact information for Conexxus on this slide. Please reach out with any questions or comments on Conexxus. Thanks. I'll now turn the webinar over to Robert.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Visa's Automated Fuel Dispenser Fraud Mitigation Best Practices webinar. My name is Robert Alant, and I support fuel merchants out of Visa's Global Payment Experience and Solutions Group. As Jenny said, I'm joined today by a couple of my Visa colleagues, Sydney Green and Andrew McCoy, who will introduce themselves later in the webinar. Together, we want to share some tools and best practices to help you reduce fraud out at your fuel pumps. Let's take a brief look at the agenda for today's webinar. We are going to start out by reviewing AFD fraud trends. Then we'll talk about some key rules pertaining to AFD fraud liability shifts, as well as review Visa's AFD fraud monitoring program. Next, we'll spend a good portion of the meeting reviewing AFD fraud mitigation tools and best practices, as well as talk about the AFD fraud landscape. Then we'll highlight some resources that are available to you on visa.com. And then we'll finish up the webinar by answering some of your questions. With that, let's get started by looking at fraud trends out at the fuel pumps. Here on slide 9 is a graph of AFD fraud trends. As a reminder, this is only transactions where fuel is purchased at the fuel pumps. It does not include transactions where the fuel purchase is completed inside the station or convenience store. At the top of the chart, the orange line you see is the rate of US AFD fraud reported by Visa issuers to us as counterfeit fraud. This is AFD fraud where the cardholder is in possession of their card, but some unauthorized person is using another card with the same account number to transact. As you can see here, the AFD counterfeit fraud started to take off in July 2016 in that time frame. And it appears to have peaked in May of this year, and we'll see if this trend holds. This is the type of fraud that CHIP is designed to stop. The blue lines below represent lost and stolen fraud. The light blue line is the rate of lost stolen fraud, where the cardholder is no longer in possession of their card and some unauthorized person has transacted with it. And then the dark blue line is the rate of AFD chargebacks associated with lost stolen fraud. As you can see here, the trend from October 2015 through August of this year has been relatively flat for this type of fraud. If we break out where counterfeit fraud is occurring in terms of dollars by the top 10 states for the period third quarter of 2017 up through the second quarter of this year, we can see here that 36% of it is happening in the state of Florida. That's more than twice the amount of counterfeit fraud from the next highest state of Texas with 17%. Next highest is California at 12%, and you can see here how the remaining 7 of the top 10 states fall out with respect to counterfeit fraud. I want to say a brief word about Florida. This past year, we at Visa have had meetings in Florida with officials in Tallahassee, including the governor's office, the state attorney general, and the Department of Florida law enforcement, to bring this issue to their attention and to explore ways that we can work with them to address it. This is an ongoing discussion that we're continuing to have with them. Here on slide 11 is a breakout of lost stolen fraud by the top 10 states. For this type of fraud, California leads with 18% of the total, followed closely by Florida with 17% and Texas with 12%. You can see how the next highest 7 states then fall out. A key takeaway from these last 2 slides that I just reviewed is if you have fuel pumps in the states of Florida, California, or Texas, you need to be especially vigilant with respect to AFD fraud. Now let's move on to the next part of our agenda, for today by reviewing Visa's rules pertaining to AFD fraud liability and the AFD excessive counterfeit fraud monitoring program that was just implemented a year ago. Under Visa's rules, issuers have liability for AFD counterfeit fraud if the account number was issued on a card that did not have a chip on it. However, if the card did have a chip on it, and if the AFD is not enabled to read the chip, then the acquirer and the merchant have counterfeit fraud liability. And that's if the card was issued outside of the US, it becomes effective or was effective this past October in 2017, so a little over a year ago. And for US issued cards, this liability becomes effective October 1st of 2020. When we talk about lost stolen fraud, the rules are a little bit different. Acquirers and merchants have liability for AFD lost stolen fraud unless the AFD transaction is chip on chip. This can be contact chip or contactless. If it is a chip on chip AFD transaction, the issuer then has the liability for lost stolen fraud. Thus, if an AFD is chip enabled, you may want to consider sending the cardholder inside to complete the transaction if the chip can't be read. This would be the same as if you are prompting for this AVS zip code at the pump and receive a no match response. Last November in 2017, as part of the extension of the AFD counterfeit fraud liability shift to October 1st of 2020 for US domestic transactions, Visa implemented an AFD excessive counterfeit fraud monitoring program, which I briefly want to review. This program only looks at US domestic transactions. It looks at AFD counterfeit fraud and sales in a particular month by location, and it has two thresholds. There's an excessive threshold if there is $10,000 or more in monthly counterfeit fraud reported on that location, and if the counterfeit fraud to sales ratio in that month exceeds 2% or more. There's also a standard threshold if there is $10,000 or more in reported counterfeit fraud in a month for that location, and if the counterfeit fraud to sales ratio is 20 basis points up to 2%. The standard program also has a 3-month workout period where the excessive program does not. This program will end October 1st of 2020 when the AFD EMV counterfeit fraud liability shift goes into effect. Now let's move on to the next part of our agenda where we will review tools and best practices for mitigating fraud at the pumps. I've already talked a little about chip. Quite simply, it's the most effective way to eliminate point-of-sale counterfeit fraud. This has been proven over and over in markets that have already fully implemented EMV. It's also good for your business as your customers will prefer making secure transactions with their chip cards. A couple of points to keep in mind. Migrating your pumps to EMV isn't going to happen overnight. It will take time and effort to make happen. Also, the sooner you start and complete the migration to EMV acceptance, the better. This is to avoid competing for implementation resources with other fuel locations as we get closer to the October 2020 date, and to avoid being a target for crooks moving to you from other AFDs that have already implemented EMV chip. Until EMV acceptance is implemented at the AFD, there are a few things that you can do to help keep fraud at bay. One practice is to implement velocity checks described here. Velocity checking is to ensure the same account number is not used multiple times in a day at your AFDs. We recommend that you implement velocity checking across all your locations and not have separate checks at each location to keep the crooks from moving between your locations. Also, we recommend that after you see the same account number twice in a 24-hour period, you send any additional attempts in the station or convenience store for transaction completion. Another tool that can help mitigate AFD lost stolen fraud, as well as counterfeit fraud, is the use of address verification, where the customer is prompted to enter their billing zip code. This is sent as part of the authorization request message. A no-match response should result in sending the person inside the convenience store or service station to complete their fuel purchase. For the past couple of years, there's been support for Canadian cardholders to enter the 3 numbers from their alphanumeric postal code in order, followed by 2 zeros when prompted for AVS at the pump. In January of this year, we mandated the use of AVS in 10 high fraud geographies, including the entire state of Florida and Southern California. So the use of AVS in these markets is not only a requirement, but also a sound business practice. Now I would like to turn things over to my colleague, Sydney Green, who will talk about another tool for fighting AFD fraud.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so as you're hearing from Robert, the crooks are definitely getting more and more clever these days, and unfortunately, you're probably experiencing and know this better than we do. But something we can't stress enough to you all is that you need to implement multiple layers of risk reviews to protect yourself. It's not enough to just rely upon one single strategy. That's why we're having this call. That's why we're walking you through some of the best practices. CHIP, of course, will be the ultimate risk management solution. But in the meantime, I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about another tool which can be implemented in the near term. That's Visa Transaction Advisor for fuel. And this service would supplement the other great techniques that Robert has just been discussing in the earlier slides. VTA, or Visa Transaction Advisor, leverages the Visa Risk Intelligence to help merchants determine whether or not a transaction looks to have a higher risk of fraud, so that we can help to block the bad transactions before the fuel is actually pumped. At a high level, the way VTA works is that Visa works with your acquirer upfront to set rules based on a Visa transaction risk score, which I'm going to go more in depth in a moment. So that's the first step. And then second step is that the consumers use their card at the pump, business as usual. If it's a location with address verification, for example, they'll input their zip. And the transaction, step 3 transaction is reviewed against our VTA rules. If it hits the score and triggers the VTA rules, then we send back a soft decline. And step 4, this in turn triggers a message to the pump that would be similar to see attendant or prepay inside, something that indicates to the cardholder that if they want to try the transaction again, they need to go inside the convenience store, and that would start a new review and a new transaction. And what we found is that if it's a crook and they receive this VTA soft decline, they will simply drive away. They're not going to head inside the store. So at a high level, that's how it works, and therefore we've stopped the crooks before they're able to even pump any fuel from you. If we go to the next slide, the objectives for the service, very important here, is pretty straightforward: to create a solution which does not require much, if any, work for the merchant. With VTA, there's no hardware or software development required. No need for you guys to touch the pumps, which we know is the very difficult chore. So no development work required on the merchant side. The second objective would be to avoid creating any extra payment friction at the pump. With VTA, it runs in the background. It's entirely transparent to the cardholder. There's no extra time for the transaction review. There's no new cardholder inputs required. So the objective here is to retain the positive consumer experience, totally run in the background, be transparent. Another objective was to provide a service that works with the other solutions. You've been hearing Robert talk about different solutions like address verification, these velocity checks, other tools you guys might be using at your locations. VTA is just adding one more layer of protection. It does not remove or alter any of the other solutions that you would be doing as well. So it works synergistically with them. And lastly, on the objectives, we've been talking a lot about chip here, so we're trying to create a solution that can be implemented now, something that can bridge the gap till you guys are able to get chip up and running, but also that could be useful after chip is implemented. VTA does not review the chip-on-chip transactions. We haven't seen counterfeit fraud there. And so it reviews the other transactions like your magstripe swipes, which is where we know that the fraud is more likely to be. So not only would this help right away while you're getting chip up and running, but also post-implementation to look at those higher risk transactions. As far as some of the service components, it is sold through the acquirers, and we review Visa branded, because you're talking to the network, so there's Visa branded, non-PIN, non-chip on chip, US acquired AVS transactions, AFD transactions. And it is activated during the authorization request. So importantly, we're not asking for any new calls into Visa, no new data to be sent. This is happening during the standard authorization that you all would be doing today. So right during that authorization request, no new data or calls required. And if the transaction triggers the rule, we send back, VTA sends back that soft decline that displays that message to the attendant, something like that. The cardholder has the option to try to go inside if they'd like to try a new transaction, but what we see is the crooks drive away. If we go to the next slide, I mentioned that I was going to dig in a bit more on how the scoring works. So the brains behind the operation, as I like to say, which is our Visa transaction risk score. And because we're the network, because we're Visa, we see every transaction. We see every transaction in every country from every merchant. Because we have a single network, we can see these transactions in real time, and they can immediately be called in and pulled into the risk scoring review. The risk scoring begins with creating a long-term profile at an account level. We create a profile on the good transaction history on a respective account. And this would include, for example, things like the usual merchant categories for that account, transaction amounts, locations where they're transacting, frequency, velocity. We actually leverage from 500 data variables to help create this profile. So what is a good pattern on that account? We then compare the new transactions against that profile to see if it fits this usual good pattern. Every time we move away from the pattern, the score is going to get worse or higher. So for example, if an account usually has one fuel transaction every month and maybe one electronics transaction every 3 months, and now we've just seen 3 fuel transactions, a few electronics transactions, every time they move away from that normal good pattern on the account, that score is going to bump up. We also leverage attributes like geolocation. So if we see a transaction in California, if we see a card present transaction in California, and 10 minutes later we see a card present transaction in Florida, we're going to know that that's not possible, and the score is going to bump up. Another variable that we include is looking at whether an account is under review for being at risk due to being part of a compromised event. So all this information is pulled together in real time as that transaction comes into us, and we assign a risk score, which is the 1 to 99 that you'll see on the right side. 1 being great score, fits the normal profile, normal pattern, but as you move up that score, 99 being miserably bad, this transaction really looks odd, does not fit within the normal good patterns for that account. So that is the risk scoring that we use for VTA. And that's how we set our rules. So if the transaction is being reviewed, it's reviewed against that rule, which is set by that risk score. If we go to the next page, very important would be if someone was interested in implementing VTA, how would you go about doing that? So for setting up the service, in order to subscribe, you should first chat with your acquirer to see if they're participating in the service. Most of the big acquirers are participating, but there may be some that we need to work with still to get them activated. So that's the first step, chat with your acquire processor. The next step would be to, as you're chatting with them, to see what kind of service agreement. So there's a VTA service agreement that the merchants would sign with their acquirer, or it may typically be just an addendum to existing agreements. The next step would be working with the acquire processor and Visa to determine what date you'd like to activate. And the final thing is that for our subscription, the way that we identify transactions that are participating is with what we call a merchant verification value. And this is a unique merchant ID that Visa assigns, and the acquirer would then add to the authorization request coming into Visa, and that's how we would know to activate the service. So when I first talked about the objectives for the service, one of our objectives was no new development on the merchant side, to make this easy to leverage from the existing infrastructure, existing authorization requests. And you can see from the setup here that we're really holding to that. There's no development required on the merchant side to participate. This is really working with us. The work is done on the Visa side. If we go to the next slide, this is my last slide. You could say, this sounds great, but is it working? How effective is it? And what's the general status on the product? We did launch the product about 3 years ago now. And as far as where we are with the implementation, today we have 34 brands that are using the service with more than 86,000 locations in the US, across the US, participating. We have 63% of the Visa non-PIN AFD transactions that are being reviewed by the service. And many of the locations that are active at the pump also are having us review their inside the convenience store. So we have 23 brands that are participating there, with 52% of the Visa transactions being reviewed by VTA. So a question on effectivity of the solution, you can see something that we've just pulled recently, looking at an area that has a bit of growing fraud, I will say, which is Las Vegas. We pulled some information about fraud rates for merchants who were participating in VTA and those who are not. So we pulled stations that are right near each other that both just sell gas. And what we found as a comparison in Las Vegas, again, is you can see on the chart in the middle of the page on the right that we had the first merchant who is a VTA subscriber using the service, and we found their lost and stolen rate by amount was 0.297% fraud to sales ratio, and their counterfeit, which is 5.5%, which sounds kind of high. This is Las Vegas, so we're definitely seeing higher rates in that area. But if you compare it to merchant B, which is not participating in VTA, you can see that their lost and stolen rate is 1.5%, and their counterfeit was a whopping 29.9, so nearly 30% fraud to sales ratio. So one example, again, we looked at one of the markets where we're seeing a bit of growth in the fraud rates at this point. So we wanted to see what a comparison would be with and without using the service. You can see down, you'll probably recognize a lot of these logos, but some of the brands, just some of them that are using the VTA service and have said that it was okay to use them as a reference and mention that they were using the service, are listed here. So this is not inclusive, but you'll notice that we have, for example, 10 of the top 10 brands that are by size that are leveraging the service and have been quite happy and had success. Anyway, so that's just a little bit of does it work, and trying to share some of the success with the VTA solution. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to share more about skimming in other areas.
Thank you, Sydney. Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Andrew McCoy. I manage U.S. merchant and acquirer risk for Visa, and happy to be here and talk to you about the fraud and skimming landscape in the AFD space. As we implemented CHIP a few years ago here, and excuse me, I'm a little bit congested. I contracted a cold, so pardon me if I sneeze or cough or as I go through this. As we implemented CHIP a few years ago, we're seeing the point of sale begin to tighten up, and fraud is shifting to locations that have not implemented CHIP cards. Fuel stations are the largest bastion of physical point of sale fraud that's happening, and where CHIP doesn't have large adoption. And so how bad is it? So what we're finding is fraud at the US fuel pumps on our network is up 42% year over year for Q2 2018 versus Q2 2017. And that now automated fuel dispensers represent nearly a quarter of all US domestic fraud in the card present environment. So these are huge numbers, and we're still seeing those numbers go up. And so it's 2 years away before the liability shift happens at the AFD. And so this is a time where I think we as an industry need to be as vigilant as we can until those protections are put in place, because otherwise this will get worse and not better. So this is happening now because there is a very large counterfeit fraud ring here in the US. Many other large markets like Europe and Canada went to CHIP a long time ago. So counterfeit fraud persisted here in the US for a very long time, and those criminals are hesitant to give up that practice. It's very lucrative for them, and they want to keep doing it to the extent that they can. As CHIP adoption grows in other areas in retail and other environments at the point of sale, we're seeing 67% of US storefronts now accepting CHIP cards. 69% of issued cards are now CHIP capable. These are mostly the big box retailers, a lot of your major issuers with high volume cards that were converted. And so those two add up to 97% of all the active payment volume we're seeing now on EMV cards. So as CHIP adoption continues to grow, fraudsters are now looking to environments where they can still use that magstripe data. One obvious area for this is e-commerce, where they don't actually have to swipe a card or dip a chip. They just need the 16-digit PAN, maybe some other credentials that they can try and test for, such as CVV2 or expiration date and address. But it's a very different environment. So a lot of the criminals that are actively doing point of sale fraud, they don't want to move to e-commerce. It's a very different world for them, and just a very different, requires very different knowledge to pursue. So the two things we're seeing the most now at the point of sale is manipulated fallback. And this is where they spoof the chip or they damage the chip. So they use it at a chip terminal, right? It doesn't work. And then it forces the card to get swiped. And then they have the counterfeit magstripe there. Issuers are catching on to this, and retailers are as well. So they're beginning to tighten up, decline those transactions. A lot of the employees at these retailers are being trained to kind of look for weird fallback for large transactions. So they're managing that pretty well. And then of course there's ATM and fuel pumps where there's still a lot of magstripe activity. I think with ATMs, particularly the standalone ATMs, maybe you have some of those inside your service stations. And then of course the fuel pumps where magstripe is still used and accepted, right? So that's what issuers are expecting to see come from those locations. And it's for those reasons that this is an area we need to tighten up and do everything we can. VTA, as Sydney mentioned, is a great option if it's not something you've looked at yet. And there are other things that we can do as well to try and prevent fraud and also to look for skimming. So I'll get into that starting with the next slide. So what should you be looking for at your service stations. So first of all, the criminals, they like to target remote locations. They're usually near freeways or highways where they can do their dirty work at the fuel station, hop in their car, and quickly be gone. And also, they're in the middle of nowhere, right? So they might be just off the freeway, not much else around it. They'll go at night or when there's not a lot of activity in those areas, and they'll try to install a skimmer or do some other activity. Look for customers that are approaching multiple fuel pumps. They might try, one fuel pump and drive to another one and use it again, or another fuel pump and use it again. They might have large containers, vehicles with modified tanks. So we're hearing more and more about these large vans or SUVs that are gutted, and then they put one of those bladders inside and they just fill those up with just an extraordinary amount of fuel, which is actually very dangerous. It's sort of like a driving bomb at that point. So we're really working with we're really trying to get those off the road. It's a hazard. And also look for multiple vehicles in a single visit or during the same day. So if you see someone pulling a vehicle in, they leave, they come back, or maybe they're walking around to other pumps trying to use stolen cards for cash, in exchange for cash for other people. Look for all that. Look for folks that are just dipping card after card in the terminals and not really pumping gas. They might just be testing, submitting the AVS, seeing if it gets approved to try and commit fraud somewhere else. So there's a lot of funny business that can happen. And it's particularly because these are unattended points of sale, right? So they can test cards, they can monetize the fuel. It's still incredibly attractive to criminals. But amongst all this, I mean, the most important thing I would say is do not have your employees directly approach anyone that's doing any of these things. More often than not, especially in the Florida area, these criminals are dangerous, right? They might be armed. They're usually a part of an organized crime organization, and we don't want to put any of your employees in harm's way. So if you see any of these things mentioned here, please contact law enforcement first. Wait for them to arrive, and then you can approach the individual or individuals with the officer. So as we talked about the organized crime circle that's around this, just intelligence that we're getting from the Secret Service and law enforcement is that they're expecting that this is not going to go away, right? As I mentioned, it's probably going to get worse between now and October 2020, or until a mass conversion to EMV chip occurs. So I would strongly urge you to upgrade to chip as quickly as you can. Selfishly, this will probably push the fraud to other stations in your area that have not upgraded to chip. So it's a very quick way to get fraud out of your stations. But I understand there are some technical challenges that take place to do that. As we look at areas where skimming deployment is still very common, Florida is at the top of the map, particularly within the 5-mile radius of Miami, Hialeah, and other parts of Southeast Florida. There is a very prominent organized crime ring over there that does skimming, and they run the whole circuit, right? So they'll deploy the skimmers, they'll retrieve the car numbers, they'll counterfeit them, they'll use that information to pump gas, and then they'll go and sell the gas, and they'll rinse and repeat. So the Secret Service has been informing us they've arrested dozens of organized crime fraudsters that are doing this in the Florida area, and they continue to coordinate and carry out sweeps in that area. Other states that we're seeing with high incidence of fraud and skimming detection is going to be Texas, Arizona, and Southern California. So what typically happens is there's going to be a large crackdown from law enforcement in one area, let's say Florida. They'll hop on one of the major interstate highways and cruise down to Texas, and then they'll go there for a little bit before heading back to Florida when things have cooled off. There's another organized crime group, in the Fresno area and in Southern California that does a similar thing. And as crackdowns happen, we've been seeing them migrate either to Arizona and to Colorado in some instances, and then they come back. And the reason they're able to be so mobile is because they can deploy a skimmer, they can collect the data. I'll get into a little bit more about skimmers in a moment. And then when they have that data, they don't need to be in the same place to commit the fraud. They can drive a few hundred miles away, use the skim data that they collected in one location, go somewhere else and commit the fraud there. And then they can take the fuel that they just used, they can drive somewhere else and sell the fuel somewhere else. So they're very mobile, they're very organized, they're well funded, they're smart, right? So we're up against a lot here. As part of that, training and awareness are critical components of this campaign. I know that the FBI and the Secret Service have been holding workshops and other things with local law enforcement in some of these highly targeted areas to train them. And we Visa continue to be notified by our partners with the Secret Service and otherwise on their successes and their arrests. So we're making progress, right? We're trying to do the right thing. We're trying to keep this out, but again, please do your part as well. So here are the things that you can do to minimize risk in your locations. I think number one is to educate your employees. Number one, really inspect the pumps every single day at the same time. Maybe it's at night before one of the shifts ends, but every single day, an employee should go and inspect the pumps. It doesn't take that long. They can go and look for broken or missing seals, any drilled holes, any screws that are loose or missing, any kind of wiring that looks out of place, right? And then after a few days, after they look at the fuel pumps, they'll know what they look like, and they'll know very quickly if something's out of place. Another thing that we're finding that they do, the fraudsters do, is they'll install a skimmer, and then they'll put a seal right over it. So it might look like it's one of those stickers or decals and everything is good, but they actually put it there themselves. So it's a little tricky, right? So you have to have an eye for detail and really make sure that the stickers that you're seeing are ones that you as a fuel station operator put on there. And again, please be vigilant. Skimmers are getting more and more sophisticated all the time. I think about 2 years ago, I gave a similar webinar, and Bluetooth was what they were using, and now we're even seeing them go to completely wireless, where these skimmers are SMS, text messaging the cards off to a mobile phone as it happens, and they're battery powered, so they don't need to hardwire it into the pump, so it's a little quicker and easier to put in. And then they're also drilling in little pinhole cameras to try and capture PIN entry. So if you use a debit card and enter your PIN, they can get your PIN as well and then try to cash out at an ATM. So a lot of trouble can result from this. Another thing to do is ensure that your fuel stations are locked with a key. Try not to use the skeleton keys that open up every single fuel pump at every location, right? The more narrow a key's usage is, the better. And make sure the key is only accessible to specific employees. Sometimes we hear about inside jobs where the employee is accountable, and if multiple employees have access to the key, it makes the investigation a little bit more difficult. Whereas if there's only one employee per shift that has access to the key, it's a little more easy to potentially narrow down a suspect if there's an inside job. Install bright lighting throughout the fuel station. This is a relatively obvious deterrent. Criminals like to operate in the dark, again, in those remote locations. So if you have big floodlights that just light up the whole fuel station, they're less likely to go there. The same thing with CCTV cameras. Highly recommend setting up a closed circuit recording, especially if you have fuel stations that are not staffed 24/7. And these CCTV cameras should record a lengthy amount of time. In case there's an investigation and a skimmer is found, you can use the footage to go back and try and see when the skimmer was deployed. And that will really help with investigation and with damage control. Cameras, again, are also a really great deterrent. And they're relatively easy to install working with a third party. You can work with vendors to upgrade your equipment. So if you want to put new locks on the AFD or other anti-tampering safeguards, please go ahead and do that. And have a response plan for your employees if a skimming device is discovered. I think this is an area that is frequently overlooked. And sometimes a skimmer is found and an employee simply doesn't know what to do. Maybe they tamper with it, maybe they don't know who to call. So on the next page, I'm going to outline for you a plan. If you don't have a plan, here is a sample plan that you can use. So first, if you find a skimming device, do not meddle with it. Do not touch it, do not poke it, just leave it be. This is now evidence, right? It's a criminal device. and we want to make sure that nothing is, we don't get the wrong fingerprints on it or damage it in some way where it could impede the investigation. You want to notify your corporate office or your franchisor, depending on your location, to say, hey, a skimming device was found at this location. They might have a protocol that you should follow instead, and you just want to notify the higher ups of what's happening. After that, and again, these other things will apply unless you have a corporate or franchise policy in place. But what you would want to do is notify local law enforcement and the Secret Service, your local Secret Service field office. You can contact the FBI as well, but we typically have more success with the Secret Service would be the most effective, but if they're difficult to get a hold of, you can start with your local police and go from there. If you have any video surveillance, please keep it. It can be used to try to find when the skimming device was installed, and then we'll know the window of exposure and which cards were used at that pump, and then we can control for that. You should also notify your acquiring bank or your processor so that they can start to collect data on transactions that were used at that pump. And feel free to contact the Visa investigations team at usfraudcontrol@visa.com. And we can help you with any of the above things, point you to the right service station and contact your acquirer for you. And lastly, maintain a summary of the event. So when it's found, document the date and time that the skimming device was discovered, take a few pictures. If you can figure out the time frame that the device was operating by you looking at your footage, document that as well. And then this is more for the acquirer, and we can work with the acquirers. We want to find the payment card numbers that were at risk while the skimmer was in place so that we can send an alert out to the issuers, letting them know that these cards may have been compromised, and they can raise their risk awareness for those accounts. And then lastly, once the investigation is complete, figure out how it happened, what more can you do, and maybe put in some additional controls to avoid a repeat incident.
Thanks, Andrew. The last topic we have to present today is a review of some resources that are available and can be downloaded from the visa.com website. To help get the word out about AFD EMV chip enablement to fuel retailers, we produced a one-page flyer that briefly reviews the reasons for making this transition. We also produced a one-page flyer on best practices for preventing AFD fraud, which reviews much of the information presented here today and can be shared with retailers. There's also an overall payment acceptance best practices guide that's available. It reviews everything from fuel purchase transaction flows to interchange requirements to information on fleet card processing and more. It's both a good resource guide as well as a training tool for new staff who may be unfamiliar with payment card processing in the fuel segment. That concludes the presentation portion of the webinar for today. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Robert. We've had several questions come in. This is Jenny. Some of the questions are about the slide deck, and again, the slide deck will be provided to attendees once you complete the survey link provided at the end of the webinar. And a question on whether the webinar is being recorded. It is being recorded and will be made available in approximately 30 days. It can be accessed via the Conexxus website or via YouTube. The first question for the Visa group is, how does bank determine what is considered lost, stolen versus counterfeit?
Andrew, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can go ahead. Generally, this is based on the conversation that the cardholder has with the bank. So they'll call up claiming that they have fraud on their account, and one of the first questions that the representative from the bank will ask is, do you still have the card in your possession? And this is a general rule of thumb, so issuers will sort of follow their own logic. But generally, if the cardholder says, yes, I have the card in my possession and there's fraud, they're going to rule it as counterfeit. They say, no, I don't have the card in my possession. they're going to rule it as lost stolen.
Thanks. The next question is, how do we set up velocity check? Is this a Visa offered program?
No, this is something that as a retailer you would do with who's ever managing your point of sale system. So you would work with them to set that up. So that's not something that is done with Visa or by Visa or anything Visa can really do to help on that. I mean, they're with Visa Transaction Advisor. Velocity certainly may be one of the components that would play into that, but the velocity checking that I outlined, the to and in, that should be done at the with who's ever setting up the point of sale system at the retail location.
Next question, using a mag stripe at an EMV enabled fuel pump, you showed the acquirer is liable for the chargeback. Will all U.S. domestic Visa cards be chipped by 2020? Otherwise, why would the merchant be liable since we cannot control who still issues mag stripe cards? Would cards with mag stripe only, no chip, be international cards only?
So, as Andrew talked about, we're coming to the point where most cards in the U.S. are going to have a chip on them. I think one of the exceptions you'll probably see will be prepaid cards that probably won't have a chip on them, but most other cards would be. So again, as I outlined on that one slide, if it's a chip-on-chip transaction, so today, really as we speak, merchants have liability for lost, stolen, fraud, which is one of the reasons that we recommend you do AVS to try to mitigate that liability, and then VTA and some of the other tools. But when the pump is chip enabled, if it's a chip-on-chip transaction, whether it's contact or contactless, then the issuer would have that liability. So from a merchant's perspective, it's your option. You can still, if the chip cannot be read, or if the card doesn't have a chip on it, you can certainly still read it at the pump, and you would still have that same liability that you have for lost, stolen. But if it's a chip card, for example, and the chip cannot be read, then you also have the option, just like you do with AVS no match today, to send the cardholder inside to complete the transaction, and avoid that liability versus doing a mag stripe transaction at the pump and still retaining that liability. And if you did still do mag stripe, we'd obviously definitely still recommend that you do all the tools. And in fact, we would still want you to do the tools even after you implement EMV. I know that question's come up in the past from merchants of, should I still do AVS even though I've implemented chip, velocity checking, and VTA and those things. And we would still, especially velocity checking and AVS, would want you to still do those tools to help keep fraud out of the ecosystem.
Thanks. Next question, is VTA being used in Canada, which has a high EMV chip penetration?
It is not being used in Canada at this point because there's so much chip that has already been implemented. So it's not being implemented there. MagStripe is such a small portion of the portfolio.
Thanks, Sydney. And next is, what is the merchant fraud liability for mobile wallet payments such as Apple Pay, and how can the merchant protect itself against that liability?
So for the mobile app transaction, so this, I want to make sure we get this clear. So if somebody has a phone and they're doing a contactless transaction off of their phone, in other words, they're holding their phone up to the gas pump, so it's a near field communication transaction, the liability for those transactions would be the same as for a card, which I already went through. I'm not going to repeat that unless I need to. But if we're talking about an in-app transaction where you pull into a station, actually you pull up a mobile app and you use that app to activate the fuel pump, under our current rules today, those are considered card absent or card not present transactions. So the liability for fraud on those would rest with the merchant. And the things that we kind of recommend that merchants do to help mitigate that fraud, one of them is VTA, which is an effective tool to help mitigate that fraud. And that those types of transactions can be segregated out with different thresholds, which Sydney can go into more detail on. But also using the existing tools that we have of AVS as well as CVV2, which we didn't cover here today, because it's used for card not present transactions typically. But that helps authenticate the card. So really when a card is being boarded into an app, you would want to make sure you're using those tools, because you don't want to get a bad card loaded on an app and then just let it do a bunch of transactions. So you really want to try to get a good card loaded on the app. And then with each transaction, you'd still want to do things like AVS. That you would do as if it was as if the pumper had read the card.
Okay, thanks. Is there evidence of inside jobs of C-store staff?
Andrew?
Yeah, can you say that again? Is there evidence?
Is there evidence within, I think within your tool, that y'all see evidence of inside jobs from the C-store staff, from the convenience store staff?
I don't know if there are any automated tools that would do it. Generally, the flags or red flags for an inside job would be extremely high fraud rates. So I think Sydney had pointed to an example near Las Vegas where there was a location with a 30% counterfeit fraud rate. Numbers like that are really, truly excessive. And I mean, that's almost a third of every transaction being fraudulent. It's almost beyond negligence. So usually that's somewhere where we kind of suspect it could be an inside job in terms of fraud. And then in terms of skimming, it goes back to just controlling your environment, making sure that your pumps are secured, you use your stickers, right? You have things locked up, and then if something does happen, you can go back and see, well, was there a forced entry? Are there any, holes drilled, or was there not forced entry and someone simply used a key to open it up? And that might indicate an inside job as well.
Thanks, Andrew. The next question, PIN-based mag stripe transactions offer a much lower cost to implement option versus EMV for the petroleum retailer with AFDs. Why is this not an option to reduce the threat of counterfeit payment cards at fuel dispensers?
Well, I guess a couple points on that. If you look at the chart I showed on trends for fraud, counterfeit fraud is the fraud that's taking off. If you remember the orange line, the two blue lines are lost stolen fraud for both the fraud and the chargebacks, and those have stayed relatively flat. So from a fraud perspective, counterfeit is the fraud that's really taking off, and chip is the tool that's going to stop that fraud. The chip authenticates the card. A PIN authenticates the card holder, so which would equate to the lost stolen fraud. So again, when you look at the charts, you're seeing the fraud take off. One chart that I didn't show, and I've used it in previous presentations, is to show counterfeit fraud on PIN magstripe transactions, and that actually is starting to go up. So the crooks are not only stealing the card data, but they're also stealing the PINs. So PIN is really not as an effective tool in mitigating counterfeit fraud as many people think that it is, unfortunately. But as a merchant, you're still able to do PIN transactions, but PIN, like I said, PIN is not an effective tool in mitigating counterfeit fraud, and we can see it from the data.
Thanks. The next is sort of the question or a request, I think, as a comment. Notification of skimmers found should also include the major oil company for branded locations. I think if
I think that's right.
yeah.
I'm not sure if Andrew had a comment about that.
I don't know if I fully understand it.
I think
It's just disclosing skimmer activity throughout the organization.
yes, up to the major oil if it's a branded merchant and a skimmer is found there,
Mm-hmm.
the merchant knows about it and is notified. But if they're branded like a major oil company, could that, the notification go on up to the major oil company?
I see.
Yeah.
Yes, I would absolutely encourage that get floated up to the corporate office, and they can make decisions on monitoring other service stations in the area. And again, we completely advocate for information sharing, right? The more information we can share as a community, the better, because the bad guys certainly are sharing information and tactics. So I would definitely urge communicating that out to the greatest extent that you desire.
Thanks. The AVS, is that something the issuer can control, or is it solely controlled by Visa or a processor?
So with AVS, as a merchant, your responsibility would be to send the AVS information in the authorization message, and then it's up to the issuer, and the issuers all support AVS, to respond with a response that would say that what was transmitted in the authorization request either matched what they had on file or not. So if in the authorization message you sent the zip code, then and then the issuer would respond whether that was a match or a no match. But there's no changes that have to be made at Visa. If a merchant elects to do AVS, there's no changes that need to be made on the issuer's behalf. It's really just a matter of the merchant working with their processor to send the information in the authorization request. And that includes, I talked about the Canada algorithm. So from a merchant's perspective, there's no changes that need to be made. I know that there's merchants that have a lot of Canadians, snowbirds that may drive down in the winter months and migrate to the southern states. And from a merchant's perspective, or if you're on a border state, all you would really do is just take whatever the cardholder inputs in and then send that in the authorization message. The responsibility for doing it correctly really rests with the cardholder in this case. And we've done a certain amount through the mass media in Canada, radio and some of the social media sites, to educate Canadian cardholders that they have the ability to send their information, as well as to tell them how to do it correctly.
Thank you. Next question, if the register says the card is blocked or stolen card, seen it in the past, but the customer doesn't hand the card to the cashier, what do we have for options?
So it's a lost or stolen card. The cardholder won't share the card with the cashier. Again, I think with employee safety is the #1 priority. We don't want to create any confrontations. So it's situation dependent. We wouldn't urge them like, hey, you got to give me that card. If they don't want to, they don't want to. Certainly we want to do read and compare, right, on the card or other things. But again, that is trumped by employee safety. So when they do come into the store, use whatever controls you want or deem necessary, but again, not to the extent where you might be putting an employee in danger.
Hey, a note here, one of the things about VTA and some of these other tools, whether it's AVS or whatnot, the good thing is that it takes it out of the clerk's hand so that if the transaction looks bad, then that transaction's declined, and so the clerk doesn't have to risk saying something to the person. They can say, sorry, it's not me. I don't know what's going on. It's just not working. So that's one useful thing, is some of the techniques that we talked about today can help with that.
Thanks. Will Visa send daily transactional level fraud data directly to a merchant?
Fraud data is available. The acquiring processors will get this, so the merchant should really work with their acquirer on fraud data. Their acquirer has the ability to get fraud data information passed on to them, which they could then pass on to the retailer.
Okay, next question. As for AVS, if there is a mix match at the pump and the customer is directed to see an attendant, What are the recommended best practices for the attendant at that point? Should the attendant ask for ID, etc.?
No, really at that point, when if the AVS comes back as a no match and the person goes inside the station to complete the transaction, and this could be a legitimate, like let's say a foreign card holder where AVS isn't supported for them, then really the merchant just needs to make sure that they electronically read the card. If they're a chip-enabled merchant, even if they do a fallback transaction to mag Stripe, if it's an inside attended transaction, they don't have the merchant has no liability for counterfeit or for lost, stolen, fraud. So you want to make sure you just electronically read the card, and then then you're protected from a fraud perspective if the transaction's approved.
Thanks. Is there a self-service web portal that a merchant can access to set VTA scores?
No, there is not. We don't actually send the score. We review the transaction and provide the determination whether it triggers the rule or not, whether it's good or bad. But we do work through the authorization request, so it's working through the acquirer, and it happens during that authorization to review that transaction.
Okay, thanks. If a merchant sees an irregular pattern of fraudulent transactions from a very specific range of bins, what is the recommended action?
I would say they should just contact their acquiring processor to notify them, and then they can kind of get in touch with the right folks at Visa or law enforcement. Andrew, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I would say the same thing. I mean, that would be unusual. Sometimes, though, card numbers can be sourced from a variety of areas, right? So not necessarily skimming, but a criminal could go on the dark web and buy a portfolio of stolen card numbers, and they might all belong to the same bin, which they then counterfeit and then go deploy to perpetrate fraud at the fuel pump. So that could happen. I would say, it would be somewhat rare. If it does, certainly work with your acquirer and/or Visa. You can contact U.S. Fraud Control to report what you're seeing, and then we can also run it by the issuer that's being hit, and they can try and step up on that bin to make sure you don't suffer any losses.
Next question, does Visa offer rewards to merchants that may give good evidence that may lead to conviction of criminals?
I don't think there are any formal, tangible rewards other than our gratuity and doing the right thing to help keep the environment safe. And again, I think it's one of those things where the goodwill goes both ways, right? So if we understand that if cards are skimmed in one location, the fraud might go somewhere else. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be vigilant about getting that skimmer down, because you would want those other locations to be vigilant as well, so that they don't get cards stolen and then use them at your station. So I think, again, we're all working together here in good faith.
Thanks. What percentage of newly issued cards will be contactless cards?
I haven't seen any of the latest numbers, but I do know there's been some big announcements on some issuers. I know Chase, there was an announcement. I think most of their cards by the end of next year are going to be contactless. So there's been a big corporate push at Visa to work both on the issuing side as far as issuing chip contactless cards, as well as working with merchants on contactless acceptance. So you're going to just see this happening more and more over the coming year. I know that there's some commercials and things that are talking about contactless. So there'll be more announcements on issuers as we move forward. But I know a lot of cards that are being reissued with contactless on them.
Thank you. Other than the liability shift and financial loss that merchants could sustain by not converting to AFD to EMV, Will there be any consequences or fines issued by the networks or the federal regulatory agencies to these merchants that are still unwilling to convert to EMV after October the 1st, 2020?
No, we don't have any additional penalties. Again, what this is for Visa is a liability shift. There's not it's not a mandate. It's not a requirement that the AFDs be converted to EMV acceptance. But as we've talked about, a number of points along the way here, and we've seen this with even on the fraud trends, because like I said at the top of the webinar, you started to see counterfeit fraud take off in the summer of 2016, and that was really about 9 months after the point of sale liability shift went in October of 2015 for for counterfeit fraud for attended terminals. So the crooks finally started to move to the pumps after they couldn't really do anything more inside. So unfortunately, these guys don't really kind of take off and do a new vocation. They just keep going to the weakest link. So we don't have a mandate. We don't have a requirement. There's no penalties other than you will have the liability for counterfeit fraud. And if you're the last one standing kind of without EMV acceptance, you're just going to naturally see more fraud come your way. So you can expect that liability will just escalate.
Okay, thank you. Chip cards by honest people do not read many times for various reasons. The recommendations of sending all customers that fall back inside would not be a good customer experience. If we choose to fall back and the issuer approves the fallback, how can we validate that they are coding it with the right message to take the liability for counterfeit versus lost or stolen?
So if you that's a good question. So if the fuel pump correctly indicates that it's chip enabled, then the liability for a fallback for a fallback on a for counterfeit fraud on a fallback transaction will rest with the issuer. The issuer won't be able to charge back for fallback counterfeit fraud, but they would still be able to for lost stolen fraud if it's not a chip-on-chip transaction at the pump. So that's all really, again, determined by one of the values that's sent in the authorization message to say whether or not the pump is chip enabled or not.
Another question around mobile is, can you clarify the mobile again? Contactless is not card, not present, but if you activate the pump with your phone, it is card, not present.
That's correct. So again, if you take a phone, a mobile device, and you hold it up to the fuel pump where it's a contactless transaction, that's considered a card present transaction, the same as if you put a contactless card or if you dipped a card or swiped a card at the fuel pump. If you activate the fuel pump by an application on the phone, so you're sitting in the car or sitting around the pump, you use your phone to actually activate the pump, that's considered a card not present or card absent transaction. And in that case, the merchant has full liability for fraud. The card data is not being read by the pump off of the phone directly. It's being transmitted, through the cloud, so to speak. And that's how the pump's being activated. It's like a card on file transaction.
Thanks. Is AMV still required once EMV is implemented at the pump?
I'm sorry, is AVS?
Yes, I'm sorry, AVS, yes.
AVS is not required when EMV is implemented at the pump, but we still, like I said, recommend that AVS is still used to prevent people from, picking up a chip card on the ground and then, transacting with it at the fuel pump. So we would like to keep AVS used as a tool to help keep fraud out of the payment system.
Next question, which is more secure, EMV contact EMV contactless or in-app card, such as a mobile app transaction?
I'll let Andrew comment here as well, but I can tell you just looking at the data that the app transactions have a higher amount of fraud than we're seeing even with mag stripe red transactions at the pump. So from the most secure, definitely for counterfeit fraud, it's going to be an EMV transaction, and then mag stripe, and then what we're seeing, the app transactions have the highest amount of fraud overall.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's no clear-cut answer. It depends on what fraud tools you're using in your channels. So a very robust card not present environment, if you're using fraud detection tools and third parties, can be very secure. But I would say overall, card not present, just in general, is the highest risk. And when it comes to EMV chip and contactless, now that we're moving to an EMV equivalent contactless, those should be largely the same at the pump. And again, you have a physical card read, and you also have the cryptogram present. So that would certainly be the most secure. And I would, again, just going back to the whole AVS, and it's always good to use a layered approach, right? So have the chip, use AVS, use VTA in a card not present space, right? Collect the CVV2, send it. Use something like CyberSource, like a decision manager, or some other fraud detection tool to the extent that you want.
Thank you. Next, as for VTA, what message would the clerk receive to know that the VTA score is elevated? Most dispensers say, please see attendant, but the point of sale gives a decline message.
That's correct. For outside, it would say see attendant or prepay inside, something to indicate they go inside. If the transaction is being reviewed inside the convenience store by VTA and it triggers the rule, then it would be a request for alternate form of payment. It would be similar. It's using a response that is already programmed into the terminals today, so it's not something new. It's leveraging an existing decline response at the terminals inside today.
Thank you. Next question, can you please give the web address for Conexxus? And I can answer that one. It is conexxus.org, and it's spelled CONEXXUS.org. Thanks. The last question, and I do want to state that some of the questions may be around specific solutions or specific vendors, or they may be questions around cost. We did not cover those in the webinar with answers, but you will receive an email from the Visa team that will answer those questions for you. And so the last one is to clarify, AVS and VTA both are still recommended post EMV, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. That completes our questions, and I want to thank Robert, Sydney, and Andrew as our presenters today, and I also want to thank all that actually joined in our webinar. Thanks for attending. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.